16 September 2023 merupakan ulang tahun ke-60 untuk Persekutuan Malaysia. So, okay, agak tua lah tu. Tapi kalau kita nak bandingkan dengan negara-negara lain, 60 tahun sebenarnya sangat muda. Tengok Indonesia. Tahun ini ulang tahun ke-78 diorang. Republik Turki pula ulang tahun ke-100. Republik China ulang tahun ke-111. Dan Empire Jepun tahun ini ulang tahun ke-155 diorang. 60 tahun kalau nak ikutkan, tak adalah lama sangat. Apa-apa pun, ulang tahun ke-60 Malaysia ini pada saya satu milestone yang sangat menarik. Terutamanya sebab kita boleh melihat betapa jauh dan berliku perjalanan daripada 1963 hingga 2023. Tapi di sebalik perayaan tahun ini, saya rasa ulang tahun ke-60 Malaysia menyembunyikan satu soalan yang pahit. Memang Malaysia ditubuhkan pada tahun 1963, tapi jata negara Malaysia pada tahun 1963 dan jata negara Malaysia pada tahun 2023, dua-dua pun rupa lain. Cuba teka apa yang lain. Saya kasih masa sikit.
Do you think Singapore is part of Malaysia?
No, I don't think so. Not that I know of. Is this new information?
Singapore used to be the fourth constituent part of Malaysia, but since 65 is no longer part of us.
No. but the name Malaysia is including Singapore. Like the SI was included when Malaya became Malaysia. So, I mean, now technically it's not Malaysia.
Well, we know that it is not part of the political entity that we call Malaysia today. But a political separation does not denote a cultural and geographic separation. It's still there. And the culture there is almost like separating New York City from the rest of the United States. Would the culture be any different?
Persoalan asas bagi video ini adalah tentang Malaysia dan Singapura. 60 tahun dahulu kita bersekutu, tapi kita berpisah. Kenapa begitu? Okey, so kalau nak ikutkan soalan itu sangat senang nak jawab. Buka buku sejarah, jawapan ada dekat situ kan? Tapi pada saya soalan itu lebih menarik kalau kita melihat kepada orang-orang yang hidup pada masa itu dan generasi sekarang. Sebab sesebuah negara itu bukan sahaja bentuknya dan kerajaannya, tetapi rakyatnya juga. Apa perasaan dorang dalam lubuk hati mereka tentang soalan-soalan seperti persekutuan dan perpisahan? Tapi sebelum kita mula, konteks ini. Pada 1 April 1946, terwujudnya satu negara baharu dengan nama Malayan. Lepas Perang Dunia Kedua, tentera British datang untuk menjajah setelah kekalahan tentera Jepun dan mereka betul-betul bankrupt. 6 tahun berperang, negara sendiri kocak-kacir dan mereka sedar bahawa tanah jajahan mereka di seluruh dunia terlalu mahal kalau nak diuruskan seperti dulu. Jadi di Malaya mereka menyatukan negeri-negeri bersekutu, negeri-negeri tidak bersekutu dan negeri-negeri selat supaya senang sikit nak urus negeri. Tapi pada masa yang sama, Singapura disisihkan. Sebenarnya ini sangat pelik sebab sebelum Perang Dunia Kedua, negeri-negeri selat iaitu Pulau Pinang, Singapura dan Melaka ditakbirkan sebagai satu entiti tersendiri. Tapi bila pihak British menyatukan negeri-negeri selat dengan negeri-negeri Melayu yang lain, Singapura pula tidak termasuk. Cuba bayangkan kalau zaman merdeka, satu Malaya merdeka tapi Pulau Pangkor jadi negara sendiri. Tak masuk akal kan? Tapi itulah yang berlaku dengan Singapura. Jadi kenapa? Kalau kita tengok dekat sejarah, ada 3 sebab yang kita boleh rumuskan. 1. Kedudukan Singapura dan nilainya sebagai pusat tentera. RAF, Royal Navy, British Army, semua diurus dari Singapura sebab kedudukan strategik di mulut Selat Melaka dan di tengah-tengah antara Jepun, Hong Kong, Burma dan Australia. Sangat berharga sampaikan HQ British Far East Command berpangkalan di Singapura sehingga tahun 1971. 2. Status Singapura sebagai pelabuhan bebas. Pasca Perang Dunia Kedua, prioriti kerajaan British di Asia Tenggara adalah untuk membuka kembali pelabuhan bebas mereka di Hong Kong dan di Singapura. Masuk akal lah. Lepas perang, dah miskin, try lah balik nak jadi kaya macam dulu. 3. Sebab British takut akan reaksi orang Melayu kalau Malayan Union ditubuhkan bersama dengan Singapura. Selepas Perang Dunia Kedua, British tahu yang penubuhan Malayan Union memerlukan persetujuan Sultan-Sultan Melayu. Tapi penubuhan Malayan Union termasuk Singapura akan menambahkan populasi orang Cina sehingga orang Melayu akan menjadi minoriti dalam Malayan Union. Pada hemat British, kebarangkalian ini terlalu teruk untuk diterima rakyat Melayu, apatah lagi Sultan-Sultan. Sebab apa yang paling penting sampaikan British tentukan untuk menyisihkan Singapura dari Malayan Union? Susah nak cakap. Yang tentu adalah British memisahkan Singapura daripada Malaya, tapi yang tentu juga adalah British tidak memikir bahawa pemisahan Singapura patut kekal. Paling menarik kalau kita melihat Perlembagaan Malayan Union dan Perlembagaan Singapura yang digubal sejurus setelah Perang Dunia Kedua dan setelah penubuhan Malayan Union. Perlembagaan-perlembagaan tersebut mengandungi bahagian yang mengalu-alukan penggabungan antara Singapura dan Malaya apabila waktunya tiba. British tak pernah berfikir bahawa pengasingan Singapura patut berkekalan. Tapi ini semua sejarah saja. Kita semua tahu Malayan Union tak kekal.
2 tahun selepas ditubuhkan atas tentangan orang Malaya sendiri, Malayan Union dibubarkan dan digantikan oleh Persekutuan Malaya pada 1 Februari 1948. Dan 9 tahun kemudian, Malaya merdeka sebagai persekutuan yang merangkumi 11 negeri semenanjung.
Sama seperti tahun 1946, Singapura disisihkan. Kita semua pun tahu yang tak lama kemudian, Malaysia ditubuhkan. Tapi cerita penubuhan Malaysia, iaitu persekutuan antara Malaya, Singapura, Borneo Utara dan Sarawak pun tak ditakdir untuk kekal juga. Pada 9 Ogos 1965, Singapura pun dibuang dari Persekutuan Malaysia. Setelah pertengkaran, konflik dan perselisihan antara mereka berdua, Malaysia dan Singapura kembali ke tempat asal sama seperti 19 tahun sebelumnya. Berpisah. Pertalian antara kita berdua yang telah wujud selama 450 tahun sebelum kedatangan Portugis, Belanda, Inggeris dan Jepun diputuskan begitu sahaja.
I recall in 1967 when I was actually much more older, 7 years old, we visited Singapore at that time, 2 years after separation. It felt like the same country because we were still using the same currency, same exchange rate, no difference at all. I remember feeling sad, why did this have to be a different country? It's so natural, it was still like part of Malaysia. It is still different because you got to go to the immigration, and then when you left Singapore, the customs officers will ransack your bag and all your things just to check how many fruits you brought.
Dad was Malaysian, and we have family in Malaysia. And I remember growing up that we used to travel back and forth there. And I can say that I do have some memories, childhood memories of me playing in Malaysia, mingling with my relatives back there. And these are memories that I can remember very clearly as well. Mum, used to say that it was a different time, so back in the days, it was good old days, simpler times they were living in, and I grant you that. But so she was living in an environment which is different and a bit slow moving. They were living in kampongs, they had fruits and veggies all around them, fresh.
I think it was like I hate the term survival, but the idea of survival comes up a lot when I think about that, like the uncertainty of like this tiny country leaving a much bigger country, or like having that separation almost be forced out of that country. I don't want to use the word betrayal, but like maybe not betrayal, but it feels like a divorce maybe. Yeah, it's like a divorce, and like a bad divorce.
After Singapore left in 1965, all our institutions were still joined up together. The newspapers did not separate until the 70s. The Straits Times as late as, I think, 1974. The courts were still joined together. I think they separated in the 70s. And we only prevented Singaporean lawyers from practicing in Malaysia in, I think, 1970. And so on. There was a thing called Sunday lawyers, which are basically Singaporean lawyers who set up firms in JB. Because Singaporean lawyers are more well regarded, so people with legal problems would prefer to run for these Singaporean-based lawyers rather than local lawyers from Johor. And these Singaporean lawyers, their firms would be empty most of the week. There would just be some clerks there handling the files and doing receptionist work. And the lawyer, the boss, would only come in on Sunday, because Sunday is a working day in Johor, but it's a weekend in Singapore. So on Sunday, they would cross the causeway and deal with their firms.
Tadi saya ada cakap tentang pertalian antara kita berdua, dan itu bukan kata-kata saja. Malaya dan Singapura memang merupakan satu rantau, satu politi yang mempunyai rakyat, sejarah dan aspirasi yang sama.
No, I did not feel that they were different entities. I felt it was exactly the same because, by the way, I was born in Malacca, and Malacca, Singapore, and Penang are both, three of them are the state settlements. If you have visited these places, you find that they're actually very, very similar. You feel somehow you are in some common ground, when you're in Malacca or in Penang or Singapore. Singapore felt the same way, So I in my mind, it was not a different place. It was exactly the same place. Plus, you got the same kind of food that you find here, the same type of language. Everyone talks the same way. We all had similar experiences too, So no, it did not feel different. It really did not feel different.
So when did separation happen?
I think it was probably at the end of my high school time or thereabouts, the 70s, mid-70s onwards. I left high school in 1979, but the British had withdrawn from this part of the world in 1972, 73. From that point onwards, I think the British ties that kept Malaya, Malaysia, and Singapore together, I think somewhat changed. Singapore started to adopt different methodologies, different procedures. So I thought things were getting a little bit more permanently different over there. By that time too, of course, the currency had already weakened. So it was no longer the same currency. We had different currencies. Singapore had a new one in 1973 or 74. They started issuing a new one. So that's when we realized that it was two different countries.
In January 2019, Singapore ended analog transmission, and we can no longer get Singapore TV channels in Johor. The media of the two countries did cross the border, very much so, especially during my childhood. We would watch Singaporean TV, because Johor you can get Singaporean TV channels, Channel 5, Channel 8, and Kids Central, and we would know all the kids show from Singapore. So after that, I think the link was severed for good. The next generation will not watch Singapore news or Singapore children's shows, because the link has been cut already.
I mean, when I was younger, especially so when I was younger, I think it's like we would go to Malaysia to experience I don't know what Singapore used to be like. I remember my parents used to say that when we go to Johor, and then they will make comparisons to last time Singapore looks like this, and I'm like, it's so difficult for me to imagine, because I grew up somewhere that looks so different. So there was always that connection of these two countries are linked, and Singapore has this crazy urbanization that happened. But Malaysia almost gives me the sense of what it was, or what my parents' version of Singapore was like. So it does feel like two different entities in that sense, but also linked in a very intimate way, in the sense that my parents' childhood looked like Malaysia a lot more than what my childhood looks like. So I do have this sense of attachment also to Malaysia. When things in Johor start to change, I also feel oh my god, no, please stop it. So in that way, it does feel like two different entities, but also there's a sense of connection.
I thought that break was permanent, of course. Everyone was way on their own, styles of governing and country running and all that. It would just be, in my mind, a political separation. Although there will be the issues of citizenships, where do you choose to stay finally in Malaysia, Singapore, but that's a separate matter, I guess. But indeed, the impact would be just that, immigration, politics. But other than that, social relationships, commercial relationships would be proven bullish. Both sides benefited from these sorts of this aspect of familial relationships, commercial relationships, it's pretty good in terms of there was no separation there. That's all I can say.
Perpisahan antara kita berdua yang diciptakan oleh kuasa luar kini merupakan satu realiti dalam kehidupan rakyat-rakyat kita. Tapi yang penting untuk diingat adalah titik perpisahan terakhir kita, 9 Ogos 1965, tak adalah lama sangat. Tujuan video ini memang untuk meneroka sebab-sebab mengapa kita berpisah. Tapi paling utama yang saya sendiri nak belajar adalah, bolehkah kita bertemu kembali? Boleh ke peredaran zaman, manusia dan teknologi menghapuskan segala pertalian yang memang semakin hari semakin pudar?
Do you think that there's any possibility that Malaysia and Singapore may come back together?
Well, as I started out by saying, I feel that these two are actually naturally part of each other, right? So, if politics were not getting in the way, these two will get together. They would have been together and they would have remained together anyway. They would not have been apart. It's politics that actually keeps us apart. But as to a theoretical question whether these two countries may come back together again in the future, I think there's always a possibility that it could come back, but not necessarily as part of Malaysia, as another state, Malaysia, or another constituent part of the thing. It could come in terms of a union of states, for example, European Union, for example. Whether that will end up, like I said, as another state in Malaysia, that is not for me to. I don't really think that's possible. But some form of union is entirely possible.
Deep down, I don't think so. I don't think it is a thing that is front and foremost on most Singaporeans' views, and I assume most Malaysians' views as well. I don't know if there's any movement that's trying to get us back together again. I'd be interested to see who these people are. But no, I think everyone's got moved on with their ways. Politically different, totally different beasts. Malaysia, you've got one extreme of politics, and then Singapore, you've got another extreme of politics. So, yeah, it's hard.
In my hopeful idea, I would like to say yes, but it's so difficult for me to imagine that day will ever happen, just because of. I think what comes to mind first is the issues of race, and for me that seems to be a big separating factor of both countries have such different takes on issues around race. Yeah, I think there's so many disagreements on race, just whether you privilege one race over the other. Singapore is this hyper practical, pragmatic society. That is destroying things at all costs for economic growth, whatever.
If you were to look at world history as a whole, Singapore is not unique. Over the millennia, these little island city-states have appeared and disappeared over the years. The most recent one that I would draw a parallel with is Venice. Eventually, there will be a catastrophe. The whole geopolitical scene has been completely thrown into disarray, and everything has to start from scratch. The island state will collapse. I'm pretty sure over the past 60 years, they've come up with layer after layer, contingency after contingency plans to prevent this from happening. But eventually it has to come to an end. It will be 100 years, 500 years, but like Venice, it will come to an end. But I'm pretty sure that if there's a catastrophe powerful enough to destabilize Singapore, it will probably have wiped out Malaysia too. And then out of the ashes, we would emerge once again. Tanah Melayu dan pulau di ujungnya.
Apa sebenarnya perbezaan antara kita berdua? Adakah perbezaan itu terlalu besar untuk diatasi? Adakah pertalian antara kita berdua terlalu pudar sampaikan tak ada harapan untuk kita nak bersatu kembali? Kalau nak ikutkan, ada je negara yang berpisah tapi akhirnya kembali. Germany satu contoh yang bagus. Jerman Timur dan Jerman Barat dipisahkan selama 51 tahun oleh kuasa asing dan di tengah-tengah Perang Dingin, tak ada satu orang pun yang fikir kedua-duanya boleh bersatu kembali. Tapi kalau nak ikutkan, banyak juga negara yang dipisahkan dan sampai sekarang masih berpisah. Semangat sebuah negara itu terbentuk oleh jiwa dan keinginan rakyatnya sendiri. Tapi sebagai manusia, jiwa dan keinginan kita boleh diubah oleh kuasa-kuasa yang lebih besar. Negara kita berdua memang telah lama berpisah. Tapi kalau nak ikutkan, tak adalah lama sangat. Dan saya percaya bara api pertalian itu, meskipun sudah malap, masih lagi bernyawa.
Jika takdir kita adalah untuk berpisah, siapa saya untuk mengubah? Jika memang keinginan rakyat kita untuk berpisah, keinginan itu harus dihormati. Tapi 60 tahun setelah kita bertemu dan 58 tahun sejak kita berpisah, saya masih berharap. Berharap untuk bertemu kembali.
Video ini adalah karya ciptaan, tulisan dan suntingan saya, Cameron Chu. Bantuan penerbitan untuk video ini telah diberikan oleh Lina Bai, Aisyah Adli dan Rizal Hassan. Saya harus berterima kasih kepada Datuk Ilanggo Karupenen, Caleb Goh, Rizal Hassan dan Gracia Goh kerana sudi diwawancara untuk video ini dan untuk menceritakan serba sedikit tentang pendapat mereka tentang Malaysia dan Singapura. Sebagai akhir kalam, meskipun waktu kian bergerak, hanya dengan mempelajari sejarah dapat kita menghayati apa yang menantikan kedua-dua negara kita di masa hadapan. Sebagai pengakhiran, saya ingin mengucapkan selamat Hari Malaysia dan selamat ulang tahun kepada negara tercinta. Dan terima kasih kerana sudi menonton video ini.